Hey guys, this is White Rock and Montana chess coach Andrew Rankin. Today I want to share with you the second video installment in our new series, Buffing Your Black Repertoire. Today's video features the Carro Kan defense, 2 knights variation. This was a game I played in May 2022 against a strong Class B player in the Montana Open. That means the game was played over the board. The game is a miniature, it's only 27 moves long, so we will go through the entire game in one video. So like I said, it's a Carro Kan defense. So we have e4, c6. My opponent plays knight to f3. We continue d5. And now the move knight to c3. This is the 2 knights variation. I've seen quite a few strong players recommend pawn takes here, but that is only a move that you're going to play in the classical variation. Where the knight is on c3, but there's no knight on f3. So in the 2 knights variation, you want to play bishop to g4, pinning the knight and getting ready to close the pawn structure. Any type of opening up of the position, I think, favors the fact that white chose to develop 2 knights before playing the move d4. So bishop to g4, and my opponent correctly questions this bishop. He immediately says, "Hey, what are you doing over here? Are you going to take my knight, or are you going to retreat?" He plays the move h3. And I really don't want to waste time. I want to get my pawn structure, get my pieces developed, castle, and then play a good game. So I'm not afraid of trading off my light square bishop, because just like in the French defense, the Carro Kan defense is designed to fix the problem with the bad bishop. And so we play bishop takes f3 and queen takes f3. And now we want to put our pawns on light squares, prepare to develop our king side, and shore up our center. So we play the move e6, and now we get this Carro Kan style, or in the last video if you watched it, semi-Slav, nice pawn structure in the center. So we have most of our pawns on light squares because we just traded off our light square bishop. Now, if you're playing this from the white side, I highly recommend that you keep the tension between the center pawns and make it uncomfortable for black to develop his pieces. You never know if the move e5 is coming, kicking a piece from f6, or if the trade is coming, maybe after you play knight to d7. But my opponent decided maybe that he wasn't so comfortable with this tension and played e takes d5. And now we have a choice. We can take with the e pawn, with the c pawn, or taking with the queen and lose the game on the spot. So yeah, queen takes, knight takes, just loses. But we should look at the reason why e takes d5 is not such a good move. And the reason is because our light square bishop is gone and we open up lanes against our king. One last reason why c takes is so strong is because we take towards the center and the c6 square is now available for our knight. So this is why I think if he's going to take, he should wait until this knight develops. Because if the knight can come to c6, I mean, black's pawn structure, black's development, all of this is going to be solid and very simple. And so my opponent played d4, putting a pawn in the center. And yeah, now the knight comes to c6, attacking the center, and this pawn is not defended. A move like bishop to e3 is definitely better than what my opponent played. My opponent played the move queen back to d1. This is questionable, either an inaccuracy or just a straight up mistake. And the reason is because of a concept that I'm always teaching my students and emphasizing, and that's the value of tempos in the opening. You need to understand that when your piece comes out and then returns to its starting square, you didn't lose 1 tempo, you lost 2 tempos, because this queen is going to have to spend another tempo to get out into the game. And so we enter an interesting situation. After black plays the move knight to f6, black has greater development because black is actually the one who's up a tempo. In other words, black is playing this game as if he started the game, like he's playing it from the white side, which means white is playing down a tempo as if he's playing from the black side. And that changes your goals. It means that black can develop his pieces and start the attack, and that white needs to develop his pieces more precisely. I'm not going to say cautiously, but precisely. And that white needs to equalize before he can start attacking. So black is already either equal or slightly better because of of the tempos gained by this queen. I'm not going to say gained on the queen because the queen wasn't forced to retreat, but the queen was a reason why black gained tempos. So white continues development with bishop to f4, and the threat is knight to b5, and then potentially getting into c7 and forking the king and the rook. We could play a move like rook to c8. I think that's the top engine move. However, I was considering other options, and I came to a move that I thought was prophylactic and prevented any trading of pieces. For example, maybe the bishop wants to come and trade off, simplifying the position, less material, less chances of making a blunder or mistake, less chances of running into tactical problems. The knight could also come to b5, and the move a6, lastly, it puts a pawn on a light square. So for those three reasons was the reasons why I chose to play a6, because I thought, hey, if it's doing three different things, then it can't be a bad move. And now my opponent, preparing to castle, plays the move bishop to e2, and I play bishop to e7. I do want to take a moment to compare the value of these two pieces. At first glance, you'd think, oh, a bishop on e2 and a bishop on e7, they're probably equally good. That's not really true. This bishop is significantly worse than the bishop on e7. The reason is because of the defensive nature of this bishop controlling key attacking squares that white's going to use in his kingside attack, and potentially going to key attacking squares for black on the queenside in a future queenside attack. For example, you can think of someday of the rooks coming to the c-file, the queen going to b6, the pawn coming to b3, and the bishop being able to access this a3 square, kicking any rook away from the c-file. So you're going to hear me repeat this in a lot of the games, is that the c-file is of utmost importance to fight for, control, and usually end up winning the game on. This bishop, however, is not really defending against the knight, because the knight's never going to jump in to attack. I don't know what it's attacking if it was going to jump to g4 or h5, and none of these squares are available for the bishop. So he's basically just getting out of the way because he can't go to d3 because then knight takes d4. So it's my opponent's turn, and I think he should castle here, but instead he played the move a3. I guess the same idea as me, preventing a knight or a bishop from getting to b4. However, playing the move a3 after bishop to e7 is a bit questionable. If you're afraid of pieces coming to this square, you should play a3 before the bishop develops, so that maybe you prevent bishop to b4, which pins the knight. I'm never going to trade this bishop off for this knight, because this is actually black's best piece. This bishop is usually a monster that comes into the game later and decides the game. He actually does that in this game, but not because of any strong play by black, but because of a mistake by white. But anyway, this piece is really strong, and I have no interest of trading it off for this knight. If we're going to put all our pawns on light squares, we have to value immensely this dark square bishop. So black castles, white follows suit. And now, before we start the attack, we want to improve all of our pieces to the maximum. So we put a rook on the half-open c-file, putting extra pressure on the knight and on the pawn behind it. My opponent decides to put a rook on the e-file, which is his half-open file, maybe fighting for greater control of e5. The problem, however, is that e5 is an outpost, and he's, controlling that with lots of his pieces, but a knight wants to go to e5, but I don't see how you get this knight to e5 in any quick or efficient way. And so the rook on e1, not sure that it's going to be doing a whole lot until this knight can somehow reroute this way, I guess like this, but that looks really hard to do. And so now it's time for black to start the attack. I'm going to pause my video and have you guys find a developing move, putting lots of pressure on white's position. Okay, I hope you guys found the move queen to b6. And this is a strong move because it puts pressure on the center. We have a queen and a knight double attacking, and we have pressure on the undefended b2 pawn. You might be thinking, Andrew, why did you call this developing move that puts pressure on white's position and not a material winning move? And the reason is because this move doesn't actually win material. There's a strong move for white that holds everything together. It defends a pawn and tactically defends another pawn. See if you guys can find that move. That move is bishop to e3 and defends the center pawn. And now if black is not careful, if black is not being precise, and if black is not calculating and plays the move queen takes b2, oh no, that's a poison pawn. And the reason is because white will play the move knight to a4, and the queen is now trapped. The queen can no longer go to b6. The bishop cuts it off from b5. The pawn cuts it off from b4. The other pawn cuts it off from b3, and the rook covers the remaining squares. The knight, of course, covers the square that he just jumped away from. So yeah, that would be a way to lose the game immediately. Luckily, that's not actually the reason why we played queen to b6. We didn't play queen to b6 because we wanted to grab material. We played queen to b6 because we wanted bishop e3. And my idea was that I was going to play queen to c7. And this is why I called this a move putting pressure on white's position and a developing move. Because now we have a very interesting situation where the queen controls this strong diagonal and the bishop is removed to this passive and arguably poorly placed square. So the bishop went from arguably the best piece on the board to now one of the worst pieces on the board. And the queen now teams up with the rook to put extra pressure on c2 and to team up with maybe a future knight or bishop in the future to attack the king. So I really liked this maneuver for black, stealing the diagonal from the bishop. Fortunately for me, however, my opponent didn't even find bishop to e3. Instead, he lashed out with knight to a4. And I say lashed out because sometimes when you're under pressure, you make these one move attacking moves that in the long term do more harm than good. We always know a knight on the rim is dim. And now he, instead of defending his center pawn, which is more valuable, he decides to defend his b pawn. So of course the queen is under attack, so queen takes d4, and this is forking two pieces. So unfortunately for white, not only is white down a pawn, but white is forced to trade off his most valuable attacking piece, and that's the queen. So queen takes queen, knight takes queen, and like I said, because of the tempos we gained and the good development that we had as black, our attack, although it successfully gained a pawn, is only just now beginning. So we took back in the center, but now we have the threat of knight takes c2, forking the two rooks. A move like c3, of course, saves the pawn, but doesn't stop the fork. And so the move bishop to d3 is basically forced. Computer says that bishop to d1 is also an alternative, but the reason why you can play either one is because your opponent's going to play knight takes, and the bishop is forced to take, and then the rook takes. I should point out, one of my students noticed that you could play rook takes, but this variation is slightly inferior to knight takes first. And the reason is because after bishop takes, knight takes, white gets to decide which rook you take. And let's just say that he plays rook to c1, knight takes, rook takes, and then rook to c8. At the end of this variation, you control the c-file, yes, but your rook is on c8. Versus in the variation where you have knight takes, bishop takes, rook takes, you control the c-file, but your rook is on c2. And you're preparing rook f to c8, doubling up on the c-file. So you have greater activity at the end of this variation than the one where the rook takes first. And white has to fight for control of the c-file. Basically, first to the c-file, first to the path to victory. And that's why rook a to c1 was played, and a big mistake would be to give up control of the c-file. So a way to keep control of the c-file is to double up. So we play rook f to c8, white takes, He wouldn't put a rook on the c-file if he wasn't planning on trading off rooks. We take back, obviously, and now rook to c1. We could play a move like rook to c6 or rook to e2. Rook to c6, after rook takes, pawn takes, we just end up with a inferior pawn structure, and rook to e2 probably just loses on the spot to rook check, bishop blocks, bishop here, knight here, and then maybe a move like knight to c5. Just removes the defender, and then you're probably getting mated. So since you're up 2 pawns, why not trade off more material? And here the bishop is undeveloped and the knight is on the rim. So we have a minor piece endgame where black is up 2 pawns. And now we can revert back to opening principles, where we have our pieces developed on f6 and e7, but they're not really active. So now we want to get our pieces active, and I think knights before bishops is a good principle to use here. Our knight can jump towards the center, but our bishop can just in one move go to maybe d6, and so we need to get our knight into the center first, and e4 looks great. Knight to e4. And then unfortunately for my opponent, he may be subconsciously thinking, oh, my opponent developed his knight, maybe I should improve my knight as well. Played the move knight to b6, and this move loses the game on the spot. There are 2 variations, however, that we should discuss. One variation wins a pawn, and one variation forces at least the trade of 1 set of minor pieces, and most likely 2. But it doesn't win a pawn. So you might be thinking, winning a pawn, of course that's the better variation. Well, I would argue that trading off the 2 minor pieces is far superior than simply winning a pawn, but keeping a knight and a bishop on the board. The reason is that knights are tricky, and knights with bishops can cause lots of problems, and you have to figure out a way to chase them around the board and trade them off. Versus if you can force trade them off right now and you're still up 2 pawns in a king and pawn endgame, that's just winning. So the variation that wins the pawn, but nothing else, is bishop to c5. A move like bishop to e3, which seemingly guards the knight and attacks the bishop, doesn't work because, oops, d4, and you got 2 pieces hanging. So that's why after the knight moves, probably back to b4, and then bishop takes check, you're just winning a pawn, but the knight and bishop are still on the board. Versus the move that I played, knight takes f2. I thought this move was really strong. If he decides not to take, such as like king moves away, then I'll just move the knight back, and there's no pawn that can ever kick my knight from e4, and so this is just a forever outpost. And if he does decide to take, for example, what he played in the game, king takes f2, we play bishop c5 check, bishop e3, looks like it's attacking the bishop, stopping the check, and protecting the knight. Runs into the same move that we looked at before, which is d4, and now he's got 2 pieces hanging, so if he moves the knight anywhere except for c4, then he loses a pawn as well. So knight to c4, pawn takes, knight takes, and then we'll talk about this in a little bit. But I do want to look at one other option after knight takes f2, which our national master in residence pointed out. What about the move knight takes d5? And this looks like it is a successful desperado, except for black has the move knight takes h3 check, pawn takes, and you successfully traded off 1 set of minor pieces and you won a pawn. So this is still completely winning for black. So let's go back to the variation that we had in the game with knight e4, knight e4, knight b6, knight takes, king takes, bishop c5, bishop blocks, pawn pushes to d4, and then knight to c4. And of course we take, and the knight takes. And now we should really consider this, because this is an important part in the game. This is a matter of technique. Technique is really important in endgames. So you might be thinking like, oh, take the knight, trade it off, and win the game. And you're right, that's probably a great move. But we want to play the best move. And this knight is pinned. He's not going anywhere. So why take him immediately? Why not play an improving move, and then when the king steps out of the pin, then we take the knight? So what's the best improving move we can play? Well, this knight is pinned. What do we do to pin pieces? We put pressure on them. So we play the move f5, threatening f4. He has to move the king out of the way, such as king to e2. Now we trade, king takes, and now we play the strong move e5. Black's king has no more activity. Sorry, white's king has no more activity. Black's king is going to come all the way to b3, win the pawns, because this guy has to stay protecting the passed e-pawn, and it's an easy win. If we don't play with good technique, such as taking the knight right away, king takes f5. Now the king actually can get in to the dark squares. And this endgame is still winning, but it's going to take a lot longer to win. And so that's why I really like the move f5. Takes, and then e5. I think this is very clean. So I hope you guys enjoyed that and learned something. And I'll catch you next time. Thanks. Bye.